We hope people, just so everybody knows that, we're really hoping that folks will take the time to learn a little bit more about our history as surfers. Okay, anytime you're ready, Brad.
All right, well, I'm Brad Turner, out of Wilmington, North Carolina, and we are a part of the Surf Jedi committee here in Wilmington, and today's guest will be the author of Empire in Waves, Scott Laderman. Very exciting book that, I'll be honest, it tore at the very fabric of my surf being. I don't know about anyone else, but yeah, I'm interested to have this dialogue with you to dive into some very dramatic moments in surfing that could help us walk into our future. Yes, please, without further ado, here's Mr. Scott Laderman.
Well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate that. And let me just ask, Maya and Brad, you indicated in an email earlier you wanted me to start perhaps by saying a little bit about how it is that I came to write this book. Is that where you'd like me to begin?
Yeah, please. I mean, I think we're really dealing with some very big questions like why and how. Like, why do we need to know all of this history, and how is this going to help us as members of this organization and these communities structure our activism so that we are being more mindful of diversity, equity, and inclusion issues than surfers have been in the past?
Mm-hmm. Sure. And I'm happy to get into those issues as much as you all would like me to. And to the extent as a historian that I'm able to add something to that. So maybe I will just start by saying a little bit about how this book came to be. So I live now in Duluth, Minnesota, because I teach at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, but I'm not from Minnesota. I grew up in California, in LA, and in the early 1990s, when I was an undergraduate in college, I ended up spending a summer as an editorial intern at Surfer magazine. And I was a surfer. I grew up by the beach in LA. And this was, a really neat opportunity. I was excited to do it. It was during that time that I wrote my first ever publication. It was a really short little article that appeared in Surfer on a fundraiser that Pearl Jam put on, though under a different name, for a member of the U.S. Navy who had gotten in trouble for reporting the Navy's practice of dumping trash overboard. Aaron Ahern, I think was his name. And anyway, I wrote a little piece on that, and that was my first ever publication. So it was a fun experience working at Surfer magazine. Like I said, it was just an internship for a summer, but had a great time, worked with great people. But one thing I realized when working there is that many of the issues that were becoming increasingly important to me as a college student in particular, I'd become increasingly active in human rights issues, were things that I didn't see necessarily reflected in surfing magazines or in the surfing community more broadly. And there was one particular issue that really got me thinking about this. I had become active in the early 1990s on an issue having to do with the Indonesian invasion and occupation of East Timor. Timor is an island in the Indonesian archipelago. It's not far north from Australia. It had been a Portuguese colony up through the mid-1970s. And when the Salazar dictatorship in Portugal was beginning to crumble at that time, Portugal ended up withdrawing from its colony in East Timor. At that point, Indonesia, which had at one point been a Dutch colony and of course set out as an independent nation in the 1940s, Indonesia made the decision to invade and occupy East Timor. And that happened in 1975, in late 1975. And particularly in the early years of the occupation, just proceeded to decimate Timorese society. A number of scholars who do work on genocide issues have classified the Indonesian period in East Timor as one of genocide. And so as a human rights activist, I had gotten to know fairly well the issue of Indonesia and East Timor. And of course, as a surfer, I knew all about Indonesia, right? I mean, it was, I think, impossible in the 1980s to pick up a surfing magazine or, surfer magazine, to be more specific, but also surfing or Breakout or some of the others, and not find a feature on Indonesia. I mean, it's everywhere. And I think we all know this as surfers because Indonesia is a nation of thousands of islands, many of which contain just fantastic waves. I mean, it's an incredibly wave-rich area. But what struck me, of course, as a surfer, that I knew nothing about the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, even though as a human rights activist, I had learned quite about this, that the Indonesia that appeared in the surfing magazines was very different from the Indonesia that I knew as this repressive and oppressive power that was instituting a genocide in East Timor. And so that raised for me a question about why this was the case. Why was it that surfers had come to imagine Indonesia as this warm water tropical paradise, this land of abundant waves, cheap lodgings, often cheap drugs for those who were into that sort of thing, and not as the international human rights community knew it, as a major violator of global human rights norms. And so when I was working, for that summer at Surfer Magazine, I kind of pressed the editors a little bit on this issue. Why is it that, the surfing magazines, which have feature after feature on, these just perfect waves at, on Bali or Java or, in the Mentawais or wherever, but they don't at all have anything about some of the realities of Indonesia as, what Amnesty International at one point was calling an Asian gulag, this military dictatorship that was responsible for grave human rights violations throughout Indonesia, as well as international aggression against East Timor. And, I think I was fairly, politely blown off by the editors of the magazine who, probably said something about, well, that's not really of interest to our readers. But it sort of bothered me. And, so I finished working as an intern for that summer at Surfer and kept in touch with the editors that I had worked with. And a few years later, two Timorese activists won the Nobel Peace Prize. And I saw this as an opportunity perhaps to try to make some sort of contribution to the narrative within the surfing community about Indonesia. If the international community through the Nobel Peace Prize has just recognized the validity of the Timorese struggle against Indonesian occupation, maybe it's time for surfers to start paying attention to that as well. And so I got in touch with the editors that I had worked with at the magazine. I said, hey, as you probably know, these two Timorese activists just won the Nobel Peace Prize. How about if I write something up about this, in a way that might appeal to surfers, make some important connections there. And they actually said, sure, yeah, go for it. Let's pursue that. And so I did. I wrote up a piece, and I took it very seriously. I reached out to members of the Timorese community. I reached out to human rights activists. I reached out to people who worked in the Indonesian consulate in San Francisco, which is where I was living at the time. They never responded to my request, but I tried really hard to write a piece that was comprehensive, fair, and that would make those important connections. And so I wrote something up and I sent it down to Surfer, and then they never ran it. And it's possible I wrote a piece that really just sucked. Maybe it wasn't a good piece. I didn't think so. I actually thought it was a pretty decent piece. And it bothered me that, that the idea of raising some of these human rights concerns among surfers was something that, not just the leading US surfing publication, but probably the world's leading surf publication, Surfer Magazine, wasn't really willing to entertain. And it raised for me, important questions about how it is that surfers who spend a lot of time and a lot of money traveling around the world imagine the places that they're visiting. And so that planted a seed for me. And I then ended up, several years later, beginning graduate school, and my training, I went into graduate school to pursue a PhD in American Studies, but I worked mostly with historians, and I got a job in a history department when I finished. And, I had this still sort of in the back of my mind, the idea of perhaps picking up this project at some point, trying to do a book on this. And other ideas were there as well. I mean, I remember in the 1980s when I was growing up, being very interested when Tom Curran, who was a surfer that I looked up to a great deal growing up in California, announced that he was going to boycott South Africa over the issue of apartheid. He was following the lead of Tom Carroll, who was an Australian surfer and two-time world champion. Martin Potter had also joined them in that campaign, and a number of other professional surfers ultimately got on board as well. So, these were also questions that were of interest to me. And so, once I got my graduate degree and got a job as a history professor, I first did work on another book that I hope would win me tenure. I was worried about doing a project on surfing. As I think we all probably know with surfers, the reputation of surfing isn't always great, particularly in academic communities. And I was worried that, people might dismiss the seriousness of the project that I had in mind. And so I turned it into a second book, after I did a first book. Going back to some of those questions that piqued my curiosity years before. How is it that surfers who spend so much time navigating the world think of the world, this larger world? How do they imagine that world? And my own training at that point was largely in the history of U.S. foreign relations. And so it seemed like a really nice way to combine both my personal interest in surfing as well as my professional interests in the history of American foreign policy. And the United States was very active in the case, for example, of Indonesia and East Timor, and also had important roles to play in the struggle over apartheid in South Africa and a number of other issues that I look to in the book, including going back to a very important moment, which was the acquisition of Hawaii in the late 19th century, effectively the colonization of Hawaii when the United States annexed the islands. It had been an independent monarchy before that. Actually, in 1893, the monarchy had been overthrown as part of a coup led by American businessmen, and they announced something called the Republic of Hawaii. But 5 years later, the United States annexed Hawaii, and that also I thought was an important issue. And again, thinking about this from the perspective of the history of U.S. foreign relations, a very important moment, 1898 for other reasons too, but an important moment in which the United States effectively announced that it was becoming an overseas imperial power. And so I was trying to tie a number of these things together, ways that I saw surfing and surfers interacting with the larger world, from a historical perspective, into a study that I thought might enlighten surfers about some of the things that don't make it into the surfing magazines.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think we forgot to mention that if anybody has any questions or topics they'd like for us to discuss, if you just drop them in the chat. Yeah, would you talk just a little bit about the Hawaiian roots of surfing as they have emerged through historical research, as opposed to the ways that they have been portrayed in surf media that we've all encountered?
Sure, I'm happy to, and I apologize. My dog is going crazy in the background here, so if you're hearing a dog bark, I think my wife just got home, and so the dog is going a little crazy. So Hawaii, that I assume you probably can hear. So Hawaii, is generally considered the birthplace of modern surfing. It's not the only place that surfing was done. Surfing was done elsewhere in Polynesia, Tahiti, most significantly. It also, there's evidence, of people riding waves, not necessarily standing up more prone, but riding waves in West Africa. Kevin Dawson, who's a historian in California, has done really interesting and important work on that. And then, you know, many people probably know about the stories about Peru as well. But Hawaii is really, you know, considered the birthplace of modern surfing. It's where it was most developed, where people were standing up, riding waves. And so it's the place that historians and surfers both look to as sort of the birthplace of what we know today as, you know, the leisurely pursuit of surfing. And it's a, you know, how surfing made it to the 20th century is an important story. Hawaii had been an independent kingdom when Captain Cook sailed through there in the 18th century. And, you know, beginning then in the late 18th century, but especially in the early 19th century, Hawaii was subject to a growing presence of foreigners in the kingdom. And this proved very problematical on several different levels. One of which was the introduction of pathogens to which the native Hawaiian population had no defenses. And so what we saw, you know, in the period of less than a century, from the early 19th century to the 1890 census, was a decline in the native Hawaiian population, just a demographic collapse of greater than 90%. I mean, we don't know what that pre-contact Hawaiian population was, but even with some of the most conservative estimates of what that population figure was, we're looking at a demographic collapse of about 90%. But you also had, you know, significantly an important missionary presence in Hawaii. This began really in 1820 with a number of Congregationalist missionaries who sailed to Hawaii, who, among other things, tried to discourage the native Hawaiian practice of a number of cultural traditions, and surfing was one of those. Surfing displeased the missionaries, at least most of the missionaries, for several different reasons. You can find some disparate voices in there. There were some missionaries who actually looked admiringly on surfing, but this was a very small number of people. Most wrote about it as a very sinful, even devilish sort of activity. And the reasons for this are a few. For one thing, surfing, you know, as we all know, is easy as done when you have very little clothing on, right? It's a lot easier to surf without a wetsuit than it is with a wetsuit, for example. And, you know, for these American missionaries in Hawaii, the idea in the 19th century of Hawaiians heading out into the water with little or no clothing on, well, that just invited very nasty things that they didn't want to think about. It also contributed to Hawaiian leisure activities at a time when these missionaries were very driven by what we think of today as the Protestant work ethic. The idea that people ought to be devoting themselves to industriousness and labor rather than participating in leisurely activities. And so the extent, you know, to which Hawaiians embraced leisure activities, which is something they had been able to really develop given the abundance and stability of Hawaiian society up through the early 19th century, you know, they took that leisure time seriously. And so this was a real problem. And then, of course, Hawaiians also like to wager on surfing. You know, they like to bet on who could ride the biggest wave or ride it the longest, you know, whatever it was, you know, it was gambling was an important part of you know, this Hawaiian leisure culture. And that was something that was frowned on by the missionaries. So the missionaries never actually banned surfing, but they did look down on it, and they attempted to shame Hawaiians into abandoning that important cultural practice. But Hawaiians never gave it up. Hawaiians did continue to surf even as the number of Hawaiians substantially decreased. And so in popular surfing histories, it's not uncommon for people to talk about, you know, the resurrection or the revival of surfing in the early 20th century, and to accredit that to particularly white Americans who arrived in the Hawaiian Islands in the early 20th century. And probably the most significant of these figures is someone by the name of Alexander Hume Ford, who was a South Carolinian, a journalist and writer who moved to Honolulu in the early 20th century, learned to surf. He was taught to surf by George Freeth, and then, you know, became probably the leading evangelist for both surfing and for Hawaii in the first decades of the 20th century. Freeth was a major booster for the American territory. Again, this is now following the American annexation of Hawaii, one that was unconstitutional, I should point out. It was not done by the 2/3 majority in the Senate as a treaty, but rather by a simple majority in the congressional resolution. Freeth had a vision for Hawaii as an American territory, ultimately becoming a US state. And he wanted to help shepherd that process along. He thought Hawaii could be important to the United States because of its position in the Pacific Ocean. He thought it could be an important point from which the United States could project power across the Asia-Pacific region. Hawaii contained a natural deep water port at Pearl Harbor that would be important for US naval forces. And again, given its proximity to Asia, this is something that he thought, the United States would be well served by making Hawaii a state. Now, a problem for Alexander Hume Ford, who we also know was someone who introduced Jack London to the sport of surfing, and Jack London is another figure who helped to popularize it in the early 20th century. The problem for Alexander Hume Ford in wanting to make Hawaii a state and usher that process along was that white people were a minority in Hawaii. And what he wanted to do then was to create a white man's state, effectively. And he actually used that language in a magazine that he started called Mid-Pacific Magazine, which was a magazine that served as, a popular outlet for, a number of things. I mean, it included features on surfing, but also articles on the importance of Hawaii's place in, this American empire that had emerged by, at least overseas empire that had emerged by the late 19th century, especially after 1898, not just with Hawaii, but the Philippines and Puerto Rico, Guam, and so on. And so it was, a vision that he thought really important. And it became a project of Ford's then to try to figure out how to create a white majority in Hawaii. And surfing then ended up playing a role in this. Alexander Hume Ford saw surfing as an important lure for tourism to Hawaii, and he became active encouraging tourism to the islands. And tourism was important because he thought if we can get people here as tourists, some of them will stay as residents. They'll fall in love with the islands. They'll see what a magical place this is, and they'll stay. And so, he was promoting tourism to Hawaii in places such as California, working with California organizations. The Hawaii Promotion Committee had a presence in California. And so, encouraging that movement of people from the mainland of the United States to Hawaii became an important objective of Alexander Hume Ford's. And one of those early ways that we saw surfing then being used in a racial and often racist sort of way beginning in the early 20th century. That even though it was Hawaiians that had persisted in maintaining this leisurely activity, Hawaiians such as George Freeth, Duke Kahanamoku, and his brothers and others who had continued to surf to make sure that this pastime did not die, even as the native Hawaiian population had collapsed. It was then in the early 20th century, a number of white Americans who tried to essentially appropriate this pastime now for the ends of encouraging Hawaiian tourism and ultimately then creating a white majority in Hawaii.
Wow.
All right. One of our first questions we have here in the chat is why do surfers have a tendency towards nihilism?
Towards nihilism?
Right.
Oh, I guess I haven't noticed that all that much. I suppose I sort of wish there was a little more of a tendency toward that. I live now in Minnesota, and I've lived in Minnesota for a number of years. And so I can tell you about the surf community in Duluth, where I don't see any of that nihilism. But, in California, I was better connected, at least, to the surf community in California decades ago. Most of what I saw there was surfers who didn't really certainly weren't nihilistic, but, didn't really pay much attention to the larger world. They were just really most interested in getting waves. And so I wish that there were a little more introspection on the the part of surfers. I think we have seen movements in that direction. I will say, you know, in the 21st century, surfers do seem to be taking a growing critical look at surfing as a pastime. And there have been some documentary films that have done this. Whitewash would be one. There have been films that have looked at surfing in the Vietnam War, surfing even in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There have been, you know, a growing number of books written by both scholars, but also popular writers who have explored some of the shadier elements of surfing's past. Matt Warshaw, who wrote, of course, a very important coffee table book, The History of Surfing. He also is responsible for the Encyclopedia of Surfing, is a really bright guy, and, you know, is writing about surfing in a very celebratory sort of way. I mean, really loves surfing, appreciates it as I do, but also is willing to cast a critical eye on it. And then we do have a number of scholars, Kevin Dawson out in California, who I mentioned, Isaiah Helekanihi Walker in Hawaii, would be two. Krista Comer as well would be another who's written about gendered elements of surf culture. So there is a growing critical focus on this, but I do sometimes wish it were a little bit more.
All right. Also, you see the leftovers of the historical effort to make surfing white at work in contemporary surfing in ways that might not be obvious to this of us who don't know the history as well.
Yeah, so there's a reason that most surfers, at least in the United States, are white. You know, that there are important historical reasons for this. Part of this is a story of American segregation and the fact that, in particular, African American people were discouraged from learning how to swim and being able to go to the beach. I mean, there's a really interesting history here. And again, Kevin Dawson, who I've mentioned now a couple of times, has written about this. You know, up until the late 19th century, people of both African descent as well as Africans themselves were considered some of the world's greatest swimmers. And I point this out because in the United States, at least, by the late 20th century, there had become this myth that Black people don't swim. Right. And what Kevin Dawson does is he complicates this and says, well, you know, no, that's not the case. In fact, if you go back and look historically, West Africans were water people. You know, Africans all along coastal Africa were water people, but West Africans in particular, which is where many of the enslaved Africans who came over to the New World originated from. And some of these people were brought over particularly because of their aquatic skills. So they could work as, you know, shipbuilders, they could be building ports and marinas, they could be working in pearl diving and other sorts of activities as enslaved people. And these people were celebrated for, you know, their aquatic feats. And in fact, by the late 19th century, white people really weren't swimming. Most white people weren't able to swim. You know, the people that we think about who were sailing the seas, exploring, these European explorers, some of them drowned because they didn't know how to swim. You know, swimming was not widely done among white Americans or Europeans. I mean, there were exceptions, of course. But what we saw in the 20th century, and now thinking about the American context, was a number of structural issues that prevented Black people in particular from being able to learn how to swim, and not knowing how to swim to be able to fully participate in the surf community. Segregated pools, for example, would be an issue here, where Black people did not have the same access to public pools that white people did. And that was a really important thing. But also housing and residential patterns were just critical. You know, the coast tends to have some of the most expensive real estate in the country. Certainly where I grew up in California. I mean, if you're not a millionaire, a multimillionaire, you're not going to be living anywhere near the beach. And so, you know, the ability just to access the coast, not just the sort of access that, you know, that many surfers think about here, you know, public beach access so that I can drive and you know, get down to the beach, find a way to access this stretch of coast between the mansions lining, the beach. But even the ability to get to the beach, right? If you're a low income person, you don't have a car and public transportation. I mean, in LA, for example, to get, if you're going from East LA to the beach, it's going to take you hours to get out there with numerous bus transfers. And so, there are reasons that surfing in the United States developed largely as a white pastime, having to do with access to the ability to swim, access to the coast. And this, I think, here I'm not speaking as a historian, but just as, an observer of surf culture in the 21st century, I think places then a special obligation on white surfers in particular to ensure that Black folks, other people of color, have access to the coast and are invited into the surfing community, which I know is tough for surfers, right? Because surfers, when we go to the, surf, we don't want to go to crowded surf breaks, right? We want to find the place where there aren't a lot of people. Localism, then becomes an enormous problem as well. Just to build on what I was saying before, right? That, the idea that, local surf breaks, local people should, have special privileges at those breaks. That's a real barrier for surfers of color, who might get there and interpret the stink eye that they're getting from the local surfers in ways that, suggest racial hostility. And that's probably a reality too. Surfers of color often stick out in the lineup because it is mostly white surfers. And so I think, the American surf community, which is largely a white surfing community in the 21st century, does have an obligation to try to create more welcoming spaces for people who, for historical reasons, have been excluded from those spaces.
Thank you for that. All right, our next question looks like it is, why do you think the ASP and their response to apartheid from them and the governing body was so weak at the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I appreciate that the question doesn't dispute that the ASB response was weak, but just asked for an explanation of why it was weak, because it was a really shameful response, I think. For those who don't know, so apartheid was a violent system of racial separation that governed South African life in the second half of the 20th century. It became a really significant issue in global debates about racial justice and human rights, beginning especially in the 1960s. And South Africa, where apartheid was practiced, was subject to international scorn and a growing international movement to isolate South Africa until it changed its ways. And I note this because sports became a really important arena in which this isolation was taking place, with a number of different sporting bodies making a decision to no longer compete in South Africa. And, if you think about, for those who've been to South Africa and know the importance and significance of sport in South Africa, this is a nation that's fanatical about sport, about rugby, cricket, football, and so on, by which I mean soccer. And so, this was intended to hit South Africans, white South Africans, hard so that they might rethink their priorities and democratize the nation, remove those, that violent system of white supremacy that existed. And so you had a growing movement by a number of international sporting bodies to isolate South Africa. And in fact, I should point out, I'm going to say something about the ASP here, but the International Amateur Surfing Association was one of those sporting bodies that made a decision to also call for a boycott of South Africa. And so amateur surfing recognized that there was something improper about treating South Africa like a normal nation when what it was doing was simply just atrocious. And that, for surfers to travel to South Africa and compete in contests on segregated beaches, well, it wasn't a good image for international surfing. And so amateur surfing made some moves to isolate South Africa by not competing there and banning South African surfers from competing in amateur contests. It wasn't, there were holes in this and problems that I could get into, but nevertheless, there was at least a symbolic gesture along those lines. The ASP did nothing of the sort. The ASP never made any move to boycott South Africa. In fact, continued to hold surfing contests there. Why this was the case? I think it had to do with a couple of things. I mean, South Africa held a special place in the global surf community. South Africa, outside of the United States and Australia, into the 1970s, had probably the most vibrant and significant surf culture on the planet. And there was a long-standing contest there, the Gunston 500, that, I think was treated with some reverence within the professional surfing ranks. It's also the case that there were some very vocal South African surfers who were calling for the ASP not to do anything. And Shawn Thompson is the leading example of that. Shawn Thompson, who was a former world champion surfer, very smart, a great spokesman for the sport in all sorts of ways, but someone who believed that, surfing and politics should not mix. And of course, that's an idea that I think opened itself up to critique and suggesting that, they could in fact be divorced from one another, that by not boycotting South Africa, I would argue at least that was a political position. It's not only political if you decide to boycott South Africa, it's also political if you decide not to boycott South Africa. So the ASP, was very determined not to participate in that boycott movement, and in fact fined professional surfers who made the decision on their own as individuals to boycott South Africa. And a chapter of Empire and Waves deals with this. The three most significant of those surfers, names I think most of you will probably be familiar with, are Tom Carroll, who was a two-time Australian world champion in the 1980s, Tom Curran, who won the world championship, I don't want to say 4 or 5 times, I don't remember the number of times. And then Martin Potter, who was a British surfer who was raised in South Africa. He was actually a British national, but raised in South Africa, who also was appalled by the racial separation, the violent separation, racial separation that he saw, and made the decision to boycott contests in South Africa, which, as someone who grew up there and had family there, I think was a remarkable stand to take. And they were the first to announce their participation in the boycott. Shane Horan, another Australian, that first year in the announcement also said that he would boycott South Africa, though he ended up going back to South Africa the next year. He plastered Free Mandela on his surfboard, which apparently raised some hackles in South Africa, but he thought that would be sufficient then to register his protest. But Carroll, Curran, and Potter stayed away, and they stayed away until apartheid collapsed in the 1990s. And in doing so, they paid a significant personal cost. I mean, they achieved competitive success as surfers, but of course they missed out on earnings and ratings points by not competing in South Africa. I mean, it's possible, for example, that Tom Carroll, who announced that he was going to boycott South Africa right after he secured his second world championship, may have forfeited a third world championship by not competing in South Africa. We don't know for sure, but they made that decision. And I think what was considerable personal sacrifice. And I think that, importantly, distinguishes them from some of the other athletes around the world, not surfers, who participated in the boycott. And I say that because, if you were a cricket player who didn't go compete in South Africa because of apartheid, sure, that might have been a bit of a drag, but you were being ordered by your international association not to participate in the boycott movement. It wasn't coming at personal expense to you. Whereas if you were a surfer, you were doing this against the wishes of the ASP, again, missing out on the earnings, missing out on the ratings points, and in fact, having to pay fines for not competing in South Africa. And so I thought it was that this was really a high point for surfers as global actors, people who participated in an international movement. You know, at considerable cost, they made a moral decision that they were not going to compete in South Africa because of the atrociousness of the apartheid system. And I thought that was, you know, something that surfers ought to know more about, and thus the subject of one of the chapters of the book.
All right. So the next question we have here is, with the practice of surfing being culturally appropriative, even though modern day surfing is in some respects seems far removed from the activity as it was done historically, can modern day surfers engage in surfing while also honoring the sport of native Hawaiians, and how so?
So the short answer is, I think yes. You know, I mean, I don't think anybody's asking surfers who aren't native Hawaiians to give up surfing today, right? You know, not only is it unrealistic, but it's, I think, really unfair, right? You know, millions of people surf today, and you know, we do it because it's fun, because we enjoy doing it. At the same time, I think it is important that surfers understand the history of how it was that they came to be able to learn how to surf, that there is a history to this activity, and it's a history that's often a pretty brutal and ugly history. One rooted in American colonization of Hawaii, and one that, you know, we can see in some ways continuing in the disputes that exist between native Hawaiian surfers and visiting surfers in the Hawaiian Islands today. You know, there is a great deal of respect among many surfers for native Hawaiian surfers. You know, when the, you know, surfers go and visit the North Shore today in the 21st century, I think there's much more cultural awareness than may have been the case in the 1970s, when in particular, a number of Australian pros very notoriously pissed off a number of Hawaiian locals by disrespecting them, and not appreciating the importance of surfing in the Hawaiian community, its rootedness there, and the respect that native Hawaiians felt they deserved as the people who offered surfing as a gift to the rest of the world. And so, you know, again, yes, I think people can continue to surf, but I think surfers do have an obligation to understand where surfing came from, and how it is that non-Hawaiians were able to begin practicing the sport. And here too, I mean, let me just, you know, say one thing. This is a, you know, a nuanced history, right? So on the one hand, there is that history of appropriation, you know, with white Hawaiians going and trying to appropriate this pastime as their own. But at the same time, you had Hawaiians who were very generous and interested in sharing this pastime with others around the world. And probably the two most significant figures in this regard are Duke Kahanamoku, and George Freeth. George Freeth, who was a mixed blood Hawaiian, who was not the first person ever to surf in California. There were three native Hawaiian princes who were attending school in the Bay Area in the 19th century, who put on a surfing demonstration in Santa Cruz in 1885. But George Freeth, in the first decade of the 20th century, came over to California and really helped to establish the roots of California surf culture and California beach culture more broadly. In addition to surfing, George Freeth helped to professionalize the lifeguarding service in California in ways that made the beach accessible to people that had not been before. And so, you know, Freeth, and then in the decade that followed, Duke Kahanamoku, who traveled to mainland United States as well as Australia and New Zealand, putting on both swimming and surfing demonstrations. He was an Olympic champion swimmer, helped to spread surf culture around the world, and thus, you know, share this gift with the rest of the world. But there is at the same time that, you know, important history of appropriation there that we need to be aware of.
All right. what do you think or see as one step that surfers and other beach lovers can do to decolonize the whitewashing of surfing?
That's a good question. I think surfers, too many surfers treat their local beaches as non-welcoming spaces. And I think that's a real problem. I mean, I can tell you, I'm a white guy, right? But when I head out to California and I, grew up in LA and go surfing there, I actually really don't enjoy going out in the water that much. Even though it's where I grew up, I head out, people giving stink eye, the rat race, the paddle battles that go on there. It's a very unfriendly and unwelcoming place, which, it might surprise you to hear this then, which is why I actually appreciate surfing in Minnesota more than California. I paddle out in the water here, sure, I have to paddle through some ice to get out there, but people are smiling and they're friendly. Whether, again, I enjoy white privilege. And so, it may be that I may be treated differently than some other folks would be who paddled out. But this whole idea of the beach and localism more broadly, I think is a problem in thinking about how it is that this remains an unwelcoming space. These are coastal communities that are often largely white because white folks tend to have the most wealth in the United States. And so when you're talking about localism, which, is not just a problem at Lunada Bay or some of these other spots, right, where people actually get violent. It's also just about, that welcoming presence in the water. Those who aren't from there very clearly get the message that they're not welcome there. And so, this, I don't mean to sound too airy-fairy, and decolonization is a major thing and a massive thing. It's more complicated than just simply saying, maybe if we were all just nicer out in the water. But that is actually a step that we all individually can take, is being more welcoming to people in the water.
Awesome. That sounds like a great idea and a great first step. Next, how would you envision and espouse a newer and truer colloquialism?
A newer and truer colloquialism?
Localism.
Oh, localism. Sorry. Thank you. Well, frankly, I just like to do away with the whole idea of localism altogether. I think we all, have appreciated, having access to our local breaks. It's nice to be out in the water and feel like, as a local person, you can get waves and not have to worry about, the person who's going to snake the local because you are the local. But there's so much baggage that accompanies that, and so many problems that accompany it that I think just scrapping the whole idea of localism altogether, I think, would be a positive development in surfing.
Sorry, can I jump in and follow up on that question? That was my question. I guess, what would we replace it with? Like, the idea, localism does have such baggage around it, but like thinking about surfing as originally indigenous and what it really means to like belong to a place, and the shepherding and safeguarding and conserving of a place for all people, not just those who are here in the present day, but like taking back localism and the idea of localism and what it really means to be a local. So if we were to scrap localism, what would we replace it with?
Well, I like actually where you were going with that, Graham, right? At least that's the name that appears on my screen. The idea that we all have responsibilities for the places that we visit, whether it's a local surf break or somewhere we're just visiting through, that we ought to be treating these places with reverence, appreciating that these places have histories associated with them, and that we have responsibilities to to future generations to ensure that they can continue to appreciate and enjoy these spaces. And so, you know, it's something that I think transcends the idea of localism, that we all ought to be able to appreciate and respect the places that we inhabit.
All right. I had a question. If you had seen a comparison between Tyler Wright's recent stand-up and solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and you know the three surfers that you spoke of, Tom, Karen, Carroll, and um, Martin Potter. Do you see any comparison with those two situations and bringing the politics of surfing to the surface for everyone to digest right there in your face?
I do. Yeah. I mean, and for those who don't know, I suspect most of you do, but for those who don't, Brad was referring to Tyler Wright before paddling out. I hope I get this right. Before paddling out for a heat recently at a contest, and by recently I mean last year, she took a knee on the beach for, I don't remember the amount of time. It had to do with issues affecting Indigenous Australians, and so there was a significance to the amount of time that she took this knee, and received, I think, you know, both a lot of praise but also a lot of blowback for this, and so I think there are similarities there. I mean, for one thing, this was a white person acting in the interests of racial justice and human rights, and that's important. And the fact that she was white allowed her to do it at lower cost than might have been the case if she was Black. And so I think that's important. I think it also helped to reveal in ways that were true during the apartheid boycott in the 1980s, just how disparate opinions can be in the surfing community. That, you know, I suspect most of the people who are active in the Surfrider Foundation are committed to, you know, ideas of anti-racism and greater beach access. But there are a lot of people who surf who are not. And you know, if you read some of the comments from people in response to her action, I mean, this was, you know, really ugly stuff out there. And so we can see that, you know, not all surfers are like-minded, that, you know, that there is some real ugliness out there. And I think it also just revealed, you know, the way that surfers, I think increasingly, like I said, in the 21st century, identify with issues greater than themselves, that there's a greater recognition that what we do has a politics associated with it. And this was a challenging idea in the 1980s. I mean, like I said, Shawn Thompson, you know, a very articulate, well-spoken surfer, greatly respected, was adamant that surfing and politics should not mix. And I think there's a greater appreciation now in the 21st century that these things inevitably are caught up with one another, and that, you know, by not being political, you're being political. And so it seemed appropriate for Tyler Wright, I think, to be calling attention to her concerns over racial injustice and Indigenous issues in Australia in the very public way that she did. And, you know, one difference, of course, is the audience for her was far greater than would have been the case for these surfers in the 1980s, who might have gotten a little write-up in a surfing magazine. But, you know, with social media now, and I admit I am not on social media, but I understand a lot of people are, you know, thousands upon thousands of people were getting this message and then engaging in a conversation about it in ways that just weren't possible in the 1980s. I mean, there were surfers writing in letters to the magazines in the 1980s, but, you know, you just get a little smattering of things here and there. Whereas you can have hundreds or thousands of people participating in these conversations, you know, in their different social circles in ways that I think, you know, provide greater avenues for change now in 2021 or 2020 than would have been the case in 1985 when Carroll, Curran, and Potter were announcing that they were going to boycott South Africa.
I just wanted to also maybe make a comment or just observation that maybe the reluctance of the ASP to boycott South Africa was in some way tied to its interest in trying to grow the brand, trying to grow the organization, because ASP at that time was a very young organization as well. It had come out of the ruins of another organization in the late 70s. So if you think late 70s, early 80s, the ASP is really not what we think of it as today. You know, Shawn Thompson also had I think some business interest too, because he was also, you know, on the, you know, I think he owned some retail or had some interest in clothing lines too. So I think, you know, I don't know. I have mixed opinions about Shawn Thompson because he's also part of the you know, the whole bronzed Aussie thing in the 70s, and I don't know. He's painted historically with, I think, a little bit more glowingly than maybe he deserves. So anyway, just wanted to push back a little bit on Shawn Thompson. Sorry.
I'm not a defender of Shawn Thompson. I interviewed him. I appreciated that he spoke with me. He was very frank about his views, but I think it's also clear for those who read Empire and Waves that I don't agree with them. I tried to be very respectful in my treatment of Shawn Thompson because I think he very genuinely came by his position. But yeah, I didn't agree with him, and certainly am not going to defend him here.
All right. Next question. Do you think the experience of white surfers being the minority and some of the resistance and challenges they experienced in Hawaii in the 1970s could have influenced how they saw apartheid in South Africa?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, it's interesting in thinking about how white surfers from Hawaii, or at least white surfers who lived in Hawaii, responded to apartheid South Africa. It was quite easy for many of them to ignore what was going on. You know, one of the stories I tell in Empire and Waves is the experience of Eddie Aikau, who traveled to South Africa in the early 1970s. Many of you, I suspect, know the name Eddie Aikau. Eddie Aikau comes from a very famous surfing family in Hawaii, a native Hawaiian family, and he died very tragically in the ocean, or I should say, he disappeared and hasn't been seen since. When he was trying to save some people in the ocean on a ship, had a surfboard and started paddling off, trying to get to land to get help. You know, someone who's highly revered in surfing, and of course, you know, the Eddie Aikau Big Wave Challenge in Hawaii is named after him. Eddie Aikau was able to go to South Africa in the early 1970s because he placed highly in a contest in Hawaii, and he was accompanied by a white Hawaiian, or at least someone living in Hawaii, a haole by the name of Jeff Hackman. And Eddie Aikau faced racist treatment in South Africa. You know, and this is something that the ASP had to contend with by the 1980s, that professional surfers of color, particularly Native Hawaiians, were facing racist treatment there in ways that, you know, had the ASP been willing to take a stand, you know, would have provided an excellent excuse for them not to continue competing in South Africa. If you know, their athletes were not being treated fairly there, you know, and these were folks who were being denied the ability to eat in restaurants or to go into nightclubs when, you know, the professional surfers were going out to nightclubs. They were surfing on segregated beaches. The South African government got around this by trying to grant honorary whiteness, essentially, to these Native Hawaiian surfers in going to Hawaii. But of course, that only goes so far. It's not going to do you much good when the white South African club owner doesn't let you in, or the hotel proprietor doesn't allow you to stay there. And Eddie Aikau in the early 1970s was a Native Hawaiian, a dark-skinned Native Hawaiian who faced racist treatment. He was denied the ability to stay at the hotel that he was going to stay at there. Wrote about this afterwards, saying, he's never felt fear like he felt walking the streets in South Africa. And he also wrote about his disappointment that, his white Hawaiian teammates there, he felt abandoned him. That was something that he noticed very much, that, as he was facing these problems, it was very easy for his white Hawaiian teammates to essentially ignore the treatment that he was experiencing and continue to compete and travel in South Africa as if nothing was wrong. Going back to the question of whether, that understanding of being a minority for white surfers in Hawaii may have helped them appreciate some of the position, it led them to adopt some of the positions they took later. It's possible, but I also don't see much to celebrate in the actions of some of these white surfers. And it was, Howleys in Hawaii. It was some Australian surfers and American surfers who were largely dismissive of the concerns over apartheid in interviews in the 1970s and 1980s. Why would I care about that stuff? It doesn't affect me. Why should it bother me? Things that I think years later, reading back, I would hope they'd feel ashamed of the things that they said at the time. Anyway, that's probably an indirect response to that question, but it's about the best I've got right now.
It seems, if I could just interrupt and say, it seems particularly heartbreaking that Eddie Aikau is, most famous for rescuing, I think it was like 500 people at Waimea Beach. And I'm certain that he never paused to think about, what that person looked like. And to have his teammates not come to his rescue at a moment when he was facing potential danger and fear, it just seems like a cautionary tale for all of us. And you said, that you don't want to sound airy-fairy about being nicer in the water, but, that was a moment when being nicer to Eddie Aikau would have demanded some courage and, and just decency, and his teammates failed him. And I mean, it just seems like a good thing for us to all sort of hold in our hearts as we figure out how to address these issues.
All right. I saw a number of movies referenced in this book that pretty much every one of them is in my collection. And I would imagine as surfers, you also have them in your collection. One of the main titles in this collection that everyone probably has is The Endless Summer. Great movie. But as I reference my memory, I come to parts that are difficult for me to digest as an African American surfer, and I wondered, I don't know, what was your perspective on that kind of dynamic of the enjoyment of surfing, again, being there in front of you, but you're not dealing with the other elephant in the room, which is, apartheid in South Africa, or the apparent racism in a movie that we all love.
Yeah, The Endless Summer, I trust everybody in this conversation is familiar with The Endless Summer. I mean, it's considered the great surf flick. This is Bruce Brown's film from the 1960s. Wasn't his first movie, but, was the movie that made Bruce Brown. And until the Michael Moore era, was the most commercially successful documentary film in history. And it's a classic, and it's a great film in all sorts of ways. I mean, I have watched that movie, I don't know how many dozens of times, right? I as a kid, I'd throw on the video cassette. This is back when things were on video cassette, and I'd watch The Endless Summer from beginning to end. It seemed like every day. And of course, that's what planted for me in the seed when I was completely clueless as a kid. God, I want to go to South Africa sometime and surf Cape St. Francis. I remember, in fact, how devastated I was when I was interning at Surfer Magazine. This is when The Endless Summer 2 came out. And one of the things they had me do at Surfer was call Bruce Brown and interview him about The Endless Summer 2. And I don't remember what questions that I asked him, but I do remember at one point he mentioned, and this is when it was not common knowledge, at least I didn't know it, that, in fact, when they went and surfed Cape St. Francis, it was good for about an hour, but, it's almost never good. And everything he said about it in the movie is just a lie, that it's not, however many hundreds of days a year where it's perfect. Sometimes it breaks 7 miles out on the point all the way in, that stuff. It's all a lie, right? And I just remember how deflated I felt when he said that, because, I spent so many hours as a kid fantasizing about Cape St. Francis, only to learn that, my dream was going to be gone. Anyway, but The Endless Summer, I mean, it's the classic surf flick in all sorts of ways. And it's an important film. It's a wonderful film in all sorts of ways, but it's also, God, just an embarrassing film on other levels. And I say this in thinking particularly about the African portions of the film. And, we can critique other parts of it, the, non-recognition of the American colonization of Hawaii, for example, and the problems associated with that. But the African portions in particular are a real problem. And, if you haven't watched The Endless Summer in a while, I encourage you to go back and watch it. Some of the things said about local African people in the film. I mean, there's one line where they're, Mike Hinson and Robert August are surfing at this island off the coast of, I think they're in Dakar, Senegal at that point. And, Bruce Brown shows some kids throwing rocks into the ocean, and says something about being good Africans. They threw a few rocks, at the Americans out in the water, or so far out. I mean, they're, hundreds and hundreds of yards away. It's not like these kids were throwing rocks at them, but, these sorts of things that, very subtle, humorous comments, but also really problematical racist comments. And then there's the whole Ghana section, about Hinson and August being the first white people ever to surf on the coast there, and the first white people the local African people have ever seen, which is, frankly absurd. And moreover, the young African children there who are bodyboarding on what, Bruce Brown jokes is them tearing down their houses in order to ride waves. That's actually, those bodyboards they were riding are the same bodyboards that West Africans have been riding for hundreds of years. Kevin Dawson writes about this in his work. But the South Africa portion of The Endless Summer is probably the most troubling to me, in that, in the 1960s, it was impossible for people around the world to think about South Africa and not think about apartheid. And Bruce Brown managed to have South Africa at the center of this film without ever once addressing the issue of apartheid, except in a very subtle offhand comment when he shows Robert August, Mike Hinson surfing in Durban. And he's talking about the shark nets off the beach there, and says something about, when you see the fins pop up in the water, your heart drops until you realize they're just a group of friendly dolphins. And then he has this throwaway line in which he says, dolphins and sharks have yet to integrate in South Africa. And that's the closest he ever comes to acknowledging the fact that they're surfing on these segregated beaches in a country that has a violent white supremacist government that's treating the local African population just absolutely abysmally. And he was well aware of this. I mean, I went in the archives, looked at the letters that he was writing to South African contacts at the time that he made the film. He was joking about apartheid with these folks, but it never shows up in that film. And I think in some ways I'm Exhibit A. In the summer, I had no idea that South Africa had this system of apartheid. And I think that's probably true of many surfers who were watching The Endless Summer at the time, that maybe that's something that we ought to know as we're developing these fantasies about traveling to South Africa and what a surfing paradise it is, that there's this other part of South Africa that maybe we ought to know something about. It might affect whether we want to go there or not. So South Africa and The Endless Summer, you know, it's a great flick in all sorts of ways. I mean, it is, you know, the classic surfing film, but it's also very much a product of the 1960s and that sort of willed ignorance of many surfers during that period, not wanting to pay attention to what was happening in the rest of the world.
If I could just say something briefly to bring this to date, this talk is being sponsored by the Cape Fear chapter of Surf Rider Foundation, and we in this area in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a coup, a successful coup in 1898, in which it was called the fusion government. It was essentially white and black North Carolinians. At that point, they were all male who were voting and elected to office, but they were collaborating and had essentially won control of the city government, and a group of white supremacists overthrew them violently. And the morning of the coup, Wilmington was a majority black city, and by sundown it was not, and it has not been since. And I think what you just said about South Africa and how people go to the beaches in South Africa and they don't deal with the violent system of segregation, and they, you know, the history is not there. People don't feel compelled to learn it. Just today in the state, in the Raleigh News and Observer, North Carolinians are arguing about whether or not to include this history in the state social studies curriculum. And there are people arguing that it should not be included. And, you know, that how many surfers and other beachgoers come to Wilmington without knowing this history? And I'm sure there are other cities that you can just, you know, substitute at will. And what we can do about it. I was reading that today about this argument about social studies. You don't think of that as an access issue, but knowing this history or not knowing this history strikes me as integral to understanding what the access issues of our various beaches are. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, well, I agree with you. I think it's critically important. And I think that coup in Wilmington, I mean, that's the only coup in the history of the United States, at least successful coup. I think that's, you know, absolutely essential history for people to know. And you know, the legacies of that coup. I've never been to the Cape Fear area, but I imagine that, you know, that there are legacies that are visible on the beaches and in the water there, in terms of who has access to the surfing in North Carolina today.
Yes. Does anybody have any final questions?
This is not a well-formulated question at all, but it's something that occurred to me just given the history of Surfrider. When I first got involved with Surfrider, it was much more about beach access. Access to the beaches was the primary driver of Surfrider when I got involved in the early to mid 90s. And some of the environmental questions and social justice questions now. I mean, even when I was involved with Surfrider here locally in the early 2000s, social justice questions were not on the agenda. So it's interesting to see how Surfrider is evolving. But I wonder if some of the questions of beach access will come back as part of a social justice part of discussion, because, you know, if you think about local beaches now, we'll name Wrightsville Beach, for example, which is a popular local beach, Carolina Beach, you know, have regularly and steadily increased their parking fees. You know, when I first moved here, I think it was $2 an hour at Wrightsville. In response to COVID, they went to $5 an hour last summer. And at what point does that have not just that has overtones for privilege and socioeconomic questions of denying certain groups to the beach. And so I see this kind of coalescing or overlapping of many different issues. And so I think it's kind of interesting that maybe we'll see maybe a back to the future, if you will, with Surfrider, where it kind of goes back to some of its origins with beach access, but it is arguing them in a new light with questions of social justice, privilege, and various socioeconomic questions at hand. So,
sounds like you got a campaign on your hands.
Huh?
Sounds like you got a campaign on your hands.
So all I know is be frank, it pisses me off with $5 an hour to go park.
Hey, Peter, we have some open positions. Come on, join us.
So, especially when you started in March and you run it all the way through October, because that's anti-local, in my opinion.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, there at one point was a streetcar that ran from downtown to Wrightsville Beach. And now Wrightsville Beach will not allow buses, public transit, to cross the bridge. So it's absolutely integral. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott Laderman.
Sure. Can I say one last thing, Maya? Actually, just building on Peter's comment there. I'd like to recommend a book to people. If you haven't read it, it's not about North Carolina, but not far from North Carolina, there's a historian. He's at the University of Virginia. His name is Andrew Carroll, K-A-H-R-L, who wrote a book called Free the Beaches that is about Connecticut, the coast in Connecticut, and centers on an activist in Connecticut in the 1970s by the name of Ned Cole. But some of the issues that you were just raising, Peter, are things that are addressed in really great ways in this book. You know, what access means. It's about beaches as public space, and the beach as public space has different meanings in different states, but it's also about access to the beach in terms of parking, in terms of actually paths down to the beach, all sorts of different things. But parking is one of those issues. And so for those who aren't familiar with it, I would like to recommend Andrew Carroll's book. I think it's a really fantastic book. And he does work in African-American history in particular. And so his interest is in how coastal communities have tried to keep African-Americans in particular away from the beach to preserve those as white spaces. And it sounds like from what Maya said, that may have been the case with Wrightsville Beach as well, with, you know, ensuring that buses are not allowed to go down there, recognizing that would bring, you know, the undesirable elements from the city down to the beach. Sorry about the interruption, but it just seemed very pertinent to what you were saying there, Peter.
Totally.
I'm a librarian at UNCW, and so for those of you that are locals, you'll be pleased to know that we have a copy of that book in the library.
Oh, good.
So you're more than welcome to come check it out. And I believe the New Hanover County Library might have the ebook version available through the North Carolina NC Live Consortium across the state. So little shout out to your libraries.
Thank you all very much for being here tonight. And if you have any suggestions about how we might improve this series, we hope to continue this and include, we've got some more exciting authors now on our list, and also filmmakers. If you have any suggestions, please keep them coming. We'd like these conversations to live on YouTube forever, so all surfers everywhere can be more informed humans. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Scott Laderman.
Thank you all for having me. It was a real pleasure being with you all tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.